appreciate it. Once again, let me do an introduction. Welcome to the July call for Listening to Indigenous Voices. I am Karina Ramirez. Today we have an amazing guest speaker, but before she is introduced to all of us here, I wanted to take this opportunity to welcome and thank Louis. Louis has jumped on board to become the new lead for this team. And I am so excited that we are going to have him here. And I had mentioned to him, he has all of our support from the Diversity and Inclusion Department. So Louis, if you can give us a couple of moments of your time and then introduce our speaker.
Sure. Thank you very much, Karina, for the warm welcome. I'm Louis Kaneshiro, he, him pronouns. I'm Kanaka Maoli, Native Hawaiian, a bunch of other stuff. Black Cabo Verdean, Portuguese, Okinawan, but that's very typical of people in Hawaii. Very excited to be with the team. I think about a year and a half, introduced both through my wife, Blair, and spent some time with Bill and Kathy, who was leading the group earlier. So excited to meet everyone and continue forward. And with that, I will introduce our speaker for July, close longtime friend. Dr. Aurora Kagawa-Viivani is an ecohydrology researcher on a Hawaii rainforest restoration synthesis project, a new collaboration between the University Hawaiʻi-Hilo Hawaiʻi Cooperative Studies Unit, USGS Pacific Island Ecosystems Research Center, and the Mānoa Water Resources Research Center. She is also the newest appointee on the Hawaiʻi Commission on Water Resource Management. And with that, thank you so much, Dr. Kagawa-Viivani, for your time, and I will pass it off to you.
Thanks, Louis, and everyone for inviting me to be here today. I'm going to share my screen, and because it looks much better than the background, the office background behind me. Yeah, I really appreciate this opportunity to think about how to communicate what I've seen and observed from my perspective with this group that's really pushing for change. So let me see. Okay, so this is a view of kind of the valley that I grew up in urban Honolulu. And some months ago, Louis asked me to share a Hawaiian, a Kanaka Maoli perspective on climate change. And although I've been attentive to Hawaii climate science and community conversations for about a decade now, I'm really just sharing my perspective. There is no one monolithic Hawaiian or even, or indigenous perspective on climate change. And it's kind of complicated. But what I'll share is informed by my positionality, the way I situate myself in the world. And my relatively I'll just admit my relatively privileged urban upbringing, my access to higher education in the sciences, and my work experiences, which have allowed me to travel different places across the Hawaiian Islands and listen to a lot of conversations, and both what's said and what's not said, right? So this presentation is really my attempt to distill what I think are important points. And I didn't know what kind of audience this was. I kind of assumed it was going to be like the spaces I navigate as a scientist tend to be like white and male. So I wanted to break things down, I guess, a little bit more in that context. And so, yeah, I'd appreciate your feedback at the end to see if what I said made sense. This is kind of an unusual talk for me, especially. So I grew up on the slopes of Puʻawaina. This is also known as Punch Bowl, where Punch Bowl National Memorial Cemetery is on the island of Oahu. And my family, like Louis mentioned, a lot of us are mixed. My family traces back to Hawaii Island, Kauai. So that's my Hawaiian side of the family, but also England, Southern China, and Hiroshima, Japan. I was raised in an intergenerational Chinese Hawaiian family. So I grew up next door to my great grandmother. And I went to Kamehameha Schools, a school for children of Hawaiian ancestry. So I got to know Louis and Blair there through, band. They were a few years older than me. I look Japanese and I identify as Hawaiian. The other part of my identity, as I mentioned, is somebody embedded in academia. I earned an environmental engineering degree where's my advance? At MIT, where Louis and I also got to know each other better. And really, I went there because I wanted to solve environmental problems, and I thought engineers solve, problems. These days, I learned it wasn't that simple, right? And these days, I call myself an ecohydrologist, and I deal with sensor data. But what I'm really interested in is water conflict and social dimensions of environmental problems. So that's kind of where I'm coming from today. So I've had this kind of wide-ranging experience. And the way I want to frame my talk today is based around a question Dr. Noelani Punivai, who teaches in the Hawaiian Studies Department at UH-Hilo, what she asked of me when she asked me to guest lecture her Hawaiian Studies class last fall. And it was, how do Indigenous voices and experiences shift the conversation on climate change? And so it made me think a lot, because I honestly don't think they have shifted the conversation on climate change enough, in my opinion. And I had to think about why that is the case. So I'll give you my answer, and then you can tell me if what I say makes sense. But the way I frame it as the ongoing legacy of colonial extraction and severing of relationships is the Indigenous backdrop for thinking about climate change. And let me explain a little bit more. Dr. Kyle Powers-White, who is of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, and he's in Michigan, he writes, portrayals of the Anthropocene period are often dystopian or post-apocalyptic narratives of climate crises that will leave humans in horrific science fiction scenarios. I've sat in many meetings where climate scientists are clearly suffering depression and climate angst. And it's a little bit strange to me, especially because, as Dr. White follows, such narratives can erase certain populations, such as Indigenous peoples, who approach climate change having already been through transformations of their societies induced by colonial violence. And the first time I actually met him in person at a climate science boot camp in Oregon, he framed it a little bit differently. He framed it as when Native peoples were being relocated from their homelands, they experienced climate change. They experienced a change of their local environments. It had nothing to do with CO2 emissions, but it had everything to do with like how they had to adapt to survive. And some didn't, but what we are, people who live now are survivors of this history. And there's some strength to be gained from that, right? So let's take us to Hawaii. This is the paradise that people of maybe my great grandparents' generation saw. And, in the background, here's famous Diamond Head or Leahi. This was their paradise. And this is the paradise that gets marketed to the world through Hawaii Visitors Bureau as a destination. But if you're from this area, I'll tell you, my grandparents' generation saw the rapid urbanization of their homes, and so it's always with kind of a sense of loss and some nostalgia that we yearn for that time before the pollution. My aunts would talk about clamming from Pearl Harbor. Even if that was post World War II, but there wasn't the same urban pollution. They could eat from these areas, and today we wouldn't even think about that. And so there's a history of loss because you've had intergenerational presence in a single place, right? The Indigenous experience has been one of constant pressure of severing water, where you see here, this is Yale Stream. All of its water is being diverted. And these are legacies from the plantation era in the 1800s, where water was taken. And what that did was it forced farmers from the irrigated pond fields in the valleys to move to other areas where they could make a livelihood, where they could pay their bills, where they could feed their families. There was severing of language. And in the in the late 1800s, there's after the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom, there was active suppression of Hawaiian language. Even though it was a primary language, there was, in the provisional government, there were rules where if you continue to give instruction in Hawaiian language, your school would not be funded or would be not recognized. And so that really, even if it wasn't legislated, it shifted and it caused a severing of language. And when you lose your language, you lose your connection to your family, to history. You don't necessarily lose it, but it becomes frayed. It becomes harder to hang on to that culture, right? There's history of an ongoing blocking of access to areas that were traditionally accessed by fishermen or for gatherers. And this has to do with, I think I would call Western American concepts of private property, which means you can exclude people from that land. And that a lot of people moving to Hawaii don't understand the customary practices where there were, even if it wasn't a law, there was an understanding that so-and-so could pass through to go fishing because that's what they've been doing for generations. The amount of land the military in Hawaii occupies is vast, and that's a complicated history, but where the military is, they leave pollution in its wake, unexploded ordnance. We're dealing with Navy fuel tanks and Red Hill with fuel leakages, depleted uranium, munitions improperly disposed. This is part of Hawaii's history. And now we have, very wealthy people engaging in land grabs. This is just one, Mark Zuckerberg, because people want their piece of paradise, but it's really hard when you're from Hawaii and you can't afford to be in that paradise. And especially with the pandemic, and many people were able to work from home, and I'm lucky I can, but we have Silicon Valley moving to Hawaii and other rural communities where our earning power is really nothing like that can keep up. So people can buy homes sight unseen, paying cash at cost that you just don't have the earning power for here. So, even before the pandemic, houselessness was an issue because of the high cost of living in Hawaii. But the pandemic laid bare these disparities, as it has everywhere, I guess, but is now accelerating displacement in real time. And so here's a picture of the real estate statistics that I just pulled offline for June, and just look at how much it's, in Hawaii, it's increased 300%, the number of sales, and the median sales price is $1 million, right? Who has $1 million at you can accumulate $1 million by the time you retire, which means if you're young and you want to have a family, it's really, really challenging. And even condominiums. Sorry, this is really depressing. And increasingly, this is sort of where, what I see in my community is people who, are living out of their cars. This is on my street too. Or if you're lucky, or, you have a little bit of beach where it's a little nicer. But just this morning, they're posting, the Honolulu Civil Beat is posting a study that wealthy out-of-state renters are driving the market in Honolulu. And, you can't blame people for not wanting to be, in where they live and wanting to be in a sunny place, but it just does make life for us here a lot harder, especially as eviction moratoriums will be ending, next week. So with all of that, it's really, really hard to think about climate change because you're just trying to survive the short term, the immediate present, right? And I think the pandemic kind of reminds all of us about that. But we do know that climate change amplifies the existing challenges. So I think Louis sent you folks the link to Jonathan Scheuer's paper on how climate change will likely intensify freshwater disputes in Hawaii. And I think of it a little bit like how the pandemic caused that run here on toilet paper, rice, and hand sanitizer. When you have fewer resources or when you have a fear of being left without, it kind of induces a grab it mentality. And yet I've also seen other behaviors in our community, and where sharing economies kicked in. So where people had good relationships with each other. If you had plenty, you helped your neighbor, right? So these stressors are, they teach us a little bit about ourselves. Why did I bring this in? I wanted to pull in a figure from a really great report I read a few years ago called Navigating Complexity about climate change and migration. And migrations are really hard, not really hard, it's a complex issue, right? Maybe in all of our families have histories of migration. And we talk a lot about climate refugees, but people aren't leaving because the weather got hot or necessarily because like the water moved up. There's a lot of other economic, educational, family sort of variables that play into the decisions, and political settings that play into the decisions we make to stay or move. And so this is important in Hawaii because we're situated in the Pacific. And you know, oftentimes people talk about climate refugees from that low-lying atolls coming to Hawaii, but people from Federated States of Micronesia and other parts of the Pacific have been coming to Hawaii for other reasons for a long time, a lot having to do with militarization of the Pacific, and looking for economic opportunities that may intensify. But what it does is it creates in Hawaii, it adds to like the tension, the local tensions of people who don't feel like they have enough to get by, and yet like more people are moving. And it's you know, yes, climate change is still an issue because we need to address these factors that are making life more difficult. So let me back up, okay, and like let's get back to climate change. And I just want to share this picture because this is an area I worked in that was hugely inspiring for me. What you're looking at is the north side of Hawaii Island, and you're facing north. I don't know if my mouse is here. Okay, this is north. This is the channel between the Big Island and Maui. And what you see here, all these lines, are walls, field walls of what was once cultivated dryland agriculture. No irrigation water, no synthetic fertilizer, and it sustained people for at least 400 years. And it supported, if you know anything about Hawaiian history, it supported Kamehameha's armies that eventually unified the island. So this area was once very productive. What it is now is ranch land. It's grazed pasture. And this is really the dry side. You know, the winds come in from this right side, the windward side, and they blow rainfall, but then it sort of dries out. It's sort of like if you're in Oregon, like the Cascade, that rain shadow effect or orographic effects. Okay. I just wanted to show you, this is working in this field, in these fields. I was working on a research project to kind of figure out how do people cultivate this, and what do we have to learn about restoring this field system, about how people managed and produced food for themselves without all the things we depend on now. And it also afforded me a lot of time to talk to old timers in this rural community, ranching community. So, so when we talk about climate change and indigenous peoples, oftentimes what we hear is this language of vulnerability, that indigenous populations are vulnerable, they're victims of a global injustice because they're contributing the least to emissions, but suffering these impacts. It's a narrative about extinction, almost as if we're endangered species. And sometimes we might think of ourselves as that way. At the same time, you have these other sort of IPCC ways of talking about indigenous knowledge or traditional knowledge as native wisdom that we really need to inform how we do climate change adaptation work, how we solve the climate change problem. And I find it really, I don't want to say, I mean, it's very confusing to me. It's almost like when I see this in policy documents, you're like, okay, am I a victim or am I the savior? And why aren't you treating me like either of those? Like, why aren't you treating me with any respect? And I think for me, what I've learned over time is that we aren't really openly addressing the fact that many indigenous communities are still grappling with that legacy of colonialism that I opened with, right? Or colonial extraction. What it has been for me more helpful is that language and thinking about of Indigenous peoples, or actually many peoples who've suffered kind of difficult histories as survivors, having not only individual kind of ability to survive, but collective survivance, that they're in relations of Indigenous communities, there is an inherent adaptive capacity that can and should be fostered. And that is tied to these, buzzwords of resilience. Like, how do you make community resilience? A lot of it has to do with making that community stronger, right? And we can engage in the language of restoration as actively, we can actively do things to restore. So I hope as I go through, this will become clear. So the Hawaii context for me is, wow, I have rambled for a long time. Okay, I'm gonna keep moving through. The Hawaii context is one of existing social vulnerability, which I already talked about, that history matters, that we need to think about things in sort of this broader scale picture because of our global interconnectedness, of this thing called path dependency, that where we are now is a result of a sequence of events in the past, and by that same token, where we can be in the future is the result of decisions we can make now. I'm going to go over climate change biophysical impacts, both in terms of scientific understanding and also Indigenous understanding. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about proximal and distal effects, like the immediate and the sort of events further on down the chain. I want to talk about existing social capacity, and that in our communities, relationships matter. And I want to close on restoration and holistic aina, land and people-centered solutions. And the pretty drawing I picked here off the web. I'm going to lean a bit on Dr. Robin Wall-Kimmerer's framing of the Three Sisters Garden of corn, beans, and squash, which she uses it as a metaphor for how we can pull together scientific understanding and Indigenous understandings to tackle some of our big challenges. So in Hawaii, the observed anticipated climate change impacts, this is straight from the National Climate Assessment Report, is that our extreme events are changing. What's very clear is that our temperatures are rising very steadily, and that has to do with rising sea surface temperatures. There's no doubt about it. It's unfortunately, it's very clear. Rainfall's changing, so we have more intense rain bombs with longer sort of sequences of dry days. So even though our total amount per year might be the same, how it's arriving differs. And that matters to people who are growing food, who are in floodplains, right? Of course, CO2 is rising everywhere. Our winds are changing, our waves are changing, heat content's changing. We have more bleaching events, and our streams are decreasing, though, how that's tied to climate change or increased pumping is a little bit complicated. What that means for our economic sectors, which is what all the policy people write about, is that, this is going to have effects on our transportation, our electrical grid. When it gets hot, we're all going to use AC, except everybody's going to use AC at the same time, and it's going to knock out the grid. And we're going to have water supply issues. Are we going to have to deal with water shortages, especially in the summer when everything's dry? That's when everybody wants water, and that's when we don't have it. And that's true everywhere in the world, right? We have higher sea levels and then storm events that cause coastal erosion. So people with their very expensive homes and beachfront are now worried about the devaluation of their property and their houses falling into the ocean. There's a lot of legal things that the state government is occupied with. And there are a lot of other impacts, but what I bring this figure up because I think it's very incomplete. We're talking about these economic sectors, but what about people, like real people, families? And that's the scale at which I think a lot of my community is basing their decisions. And that's how I think that's the disconnect that I think when I work in the climate science circles, people don't understand. Nobody cares about a grid cell, like a 1 kilometer grid cell, or your model. I mean, some people care, but the average person doesn't care. You want to know, is this going to affect my ability to feed my family, you know, to do the things I want to do? And how do we get there? So I think scientific knowledge systems are very helpful, but they're limited. And this is a long quote by Robin Wall Kimmerer, but I want to share that driven by curiosity, powerful in its understanding and scope, science can deeply nourish our understanding of the physical mechanisms which underlie patterns and processes of the natural world. Beings, which is her metaphor for scientific knowledge, have great power to feed the soil, nourish others, but if they're left unchecked or unguided, there'd be nothing left except beans. However, a bean that germinates in the company of corn, which is her metaphor for traditional knowledge, a bean that germinates in the company of corn reaches out its exploring tendrils and finds a ready support. And on the other side, she defines indigenous knowledge systems or traditional ecological knowledge as being holistic and deep, embedded in culture, specificity is a place that entails certain trade-offs in focus and capacity. So it's not going, traditional ecological knowledge is not of the same nature or purpose as maybe our scientific knowledge, or sort of mainstream scientific knowledge systems. TEK as a body of knowledge and as a process, a philosophy and a practice is inseparable from its cultural context. TEK is not designed to illuminate underlying physical mechanisms or extend them beyond boundaries of space, time, and culture. But far older than Western science, tested by millennia, TEK has evolved beyond empirical data alone. Is adequate dimension and complexity to guide questions of good and bad, right and wrong. Its holism, its refusal to separate subject and object, humans and nature, the parts of the whole make it not just a system for generating and maintaining information or facts, but a system for the generation of wisdom. And so what I have seen in my community and heard very clearly is that people are observing changes on the ground. I've also noticed that none of their stories make it to these like official climate change meetings that I get to sit in because of my degrees. Mostly because the people who are observing them tend to be what I'll call kua'aina. They're rural community members from kipuka communities. These are like communities that have been have maintained some practices and familial relationships for a long time. These communities have often been excluded from centralized decision-making. So the people who are observing these environmental changes and observe them through their practices, salt making, fishing, farming, in sailing, because they notice the winds have changed. There are different patterns to the season. Their flooding doesn't allow their salt pans to dry and produce the salt in the same way, right? And oftentimes these communities have huge social capital. They have strong relationships and ability to organize, but again, they're often classified as vulnerable. What makes them so strong? There's intergenerational knowledge transfer. So I helped with some interviewing on Kauai before, and someone responded, I used to go with my grandfather get oama. That's a baby goatfish. It's sort of a bottom feeder. You walk in the water and put your hand down and whoosh, get choked, plenty. And the diving, the first thing you get in the water and you see fish. So you have these stories of abundance. And then further uphill, you have a lot of fresh water. Growing up, we had one spring that fed the community, and that was the best tasting water ever. You know, people weren't drinking piped water, it was from the spring. And you have these stories of, you don't have that spring anymore, whether it's from climate change and decreasing rainfall, or because somebody diverted up the hill or changed, bulldozed something. We don't really know, but you do have these narratives of change. So within families, you have what would take decades to acquire. If you plug the sensor in the field, a family can hold that information, for 80 years or so. So what we have now in our communities is an active effort to restore connection after that history of severing from land, language, and histories. And so what I'm sharing with you is this Papaku Makavalu is a framework that a Hawaiian family and real renowned cultural family in Hawaii has put forth, the Kanako'oles, that helps learners and observers of the environment organize their understanding. So there's Papahuli Lani, kind of looking at the atmosphere and skies, Papahuli Honua, looking at the earth, Papahanomoku, looking at earth processes, geology, and Papahuli Honua, which is looking at sort of biological cycles. And so you go to these workshops and they're like, okay, what realm are you in? And have it gives people a frame for focusing their environmental observations. The same with Kaulana Mahina, right here, about 10 years ago or 15 now, there was a strong movement to restore Hawaiian lunar calendar observations and our understanding of lunar cycles, of, fishes move on lunar and tidal cycles. So, and it was a frame for getting people to be more attentive to their environment. Because if we're not attentive to our environment, we also won't notice when things are changing. So Kaulana Mahina, Papaku Makavalu contributed to a renewed practice of kilo aina. Kilo means to look. Kilo used to also mean the name of the person sitting on a hill looking into the bay, calling to the other people with the nets where the fish were. You're looking and observing patterns. And I consider this a form of citizen science, with the added benefit of it contributing to community and cultural revitalization. So here, the Moonface Project, it's not super active now, but there are a lot of people posting on Instagram observations from their places. What this does is together enhance environmental literacy and adaptive capacity. And in 2015, there was the Aimalama Conference in Honolulu. It was called the Pacific People's Lunar Conference on Climate Change. And a couple of us Hawaiians who are trained in the sciences attended, but interestingly, none of our university climate scientists showed up, because I think they thought it was a moon calendar conference, and they didn't really understand that the lunar calendar is just a vehicle for building our understanding of environmental change. And that understanding, that people's understanding of environmental change, is really important to getting people to be climate change literate, for it to make meaning in their daily lives, rather than just being another sort of policy report, statement, or model. And so what did Antikale Nu'uhiwa wrote in their closing report? Frankly, waiting for the local or federal government to come and rescue us from climate change is not going to happen. For that reason, the Aimalama practices, the Kilo practices, or the observation practices, can be the process in which environmental baselines are recognized and established, trends can be recognized and identified, and changes can be noted and recorded, so that our own communities can initiate the best adaptive action. We're not waiting for anyone, we're doing it ourselves. And we actually don't need a ton of money. Everyone's got a smartphone, but we need to be paying attention, and we need a simple framework for doing that, and for talking to each other about it. She continues, Indigenous communities are finding that they must realign and adapt the recommended practices that correlate with natural indicators. So, are you still fishing on these moons, on these tides? And we need to adjust them based on climate-related change. And ultimately, some ancestral wisdom and clues may not apply anymore, because we are in a no analog present and future. So I think it's to me, it showed a very clear-eyed understanding that climate change is happening, and we're not going to sort of lay down and cry about it. We need to take care of ourselves. And I think that, to me, is what individual resilience is about. So I want to talk a little bit about our social capacity. And this relates to Mauna Kea, because, let me back up a bit. What I talked about for climate observations has a lot to do with how we adapt. And I know a large effort, us adapting to something is only part of how we survive. The other part is addressing the problem itself, which is, I think, what the climate lobby is doing, right? We need to stop climate change. How do we do that? We're just people in the middle of the Pacific, have not generally felt very empowered to change the world. And yet Mauna Kea was huge for our community, for what it demonstrated, that we could have a global ripple. And so in July 2019, with the Kupuna arrest, triggered international attention, and the governor declared a state of emergency. And over time, I think the way people responded, the way we dealt with things, the way we were coordinated, became a state of emergence. So from a state of emergency, we went to a state of emergence. And I think there's a lot to learn from it. I'm still trying to understand it myself. But what I did see is like a moment of intense concern, fear, anger, worry turned into something that was inspiring. Kind of reconnections of the Hawaiian community, not just in the islands, but in the diaspora, where I reconnected with Louis too. Reclaiming of our cultural practices. And here, anybody who showed up at Pu'uhuluhulu was learning protocol. And we had the emergence of Pu'uhuluhulu University, which is sort of a joke. I mean, people were teaching, not a joke, but it's a tongue-in-cheek, that there were classes being offered at this site. And it galvanized so many people around the world, around what I would call what was important in mobilizing people was the principle of kapu aloha. And I'll just summarize it as aloha, not in the sense of the Visitors Bureau sort of cheap and marketed version of greeting somebody with a lei actually grown in Thailand, but with a deep commitment to land and each other. And so there is a saying that I learned when I was in Kohala, he va'a he moku he va'a. The va'a, the canoe, is an island, and the island is a canoe. And so Pumai Bertelman, who sails with the Makali'i canoe, it's a sister canoe to the Hokulea, and have gave me this. And the metaphor relates to the holistic nature of voyaging practices, to our everyday practices as individuals and community. I am strictly on land. I do not like getting on boats. I get motion sick, but we can all understand that when confined to a small community, it's important to pull our weight, keep the peace, be self-sufficient, as well as interdependent and in our navigation of the unknown. And so, so this metaphor, what does it have to do with climate change? Like for me, it provides me a guide for how we navigate sort of our current waters of climate destabilization in a way that's inclusive and coordinated. We have a sail plan that's disciplined. Like even if you don't like somebody on the canoe, it's maybe the same in your family bubble this past year. Like you find a way to work it out because this is who we've got. And another example of I think how our community has overcome, some difficult times and challenges. This is the island of Kaho'olawe, which was used for military bombing for many years. It was later returned to the state, after protests. And I've been able to be on the island 3 times in my life. And this is the Hali Hali line. This is where when you're going to island to do restoration work, everybody lines up and everybody hands each other their baggage, hand to hand. This is the zodiac because the boat can't land on island. And so you have to work together to make it happen. And the island, has, these are pili bales where it's so desolate, but yet people still go to work and do restoration. And it took, it didn't take very long to drop some bombs, but it does take decades of both cleaning up UXO and trying to restore the land. And so that doesn't stop us from trying, right? And through it, we're not just restoring the land, we're restoring each other. So let me back out and talk about the secular way of looking at climate change in the policy space. I usually take a hazards approach. There's this idea of like hazards overlapping with exposure. If you're a low-lying area, you're going to have higher exposure to sea level rise, for instance, overlapping with sort of social vulnerability that I talked about. And that creates risk, right? who's actually at risk from climate change or other kinds of environmental hazards. What I talked about Indigenous knowledge, about community resilience has a lot to do with our ability to adapt to the baked in changes. The work you folks are doing is more on the mitigation side, right? We need to reduce emissions to reduce the hazards of climate change. But I think right now we're in a space where we don't have time to think about these things separately. We need to find solutions that help us do mitigation and adaptation in equitable ways at the same time. And so I think the concept of aloha aina, which aina again refers to land, inclusive of people, and aloha is that relationship and kinship that characterizes our commitment and accountability to land and our earth. That provides us a guiding philosophy for developing solutions, and one that's a little more holistic. The way I think about, and to close, I know I covered a lot of different things, and in my head I'm trying to glue it all together, but what my community is very excited about is cultural and community revitalization. This motivates people. This gets everyone to work days. It lifts people up. It gives them hope. And we also have climate change, which can be very heavy and depressing. Can we do both? And Robin Wall Kimmerer writes about the restoration of reciprocity, restoration of accountability to place, to people, to each other. And I think if we can think about the restoration of reciprocity of my commitments to the people, like to the land that I buy food from, my obligations, I can begin to think more holistically about how to tackle sort of our global challenges. When we restore reciprocity, we can have greater adaptive capacity, greater ability to weather kind of these challenges ahead. And what I saw in Hawaii was Molokai kicking into sharing economies because people had these pre-existing relationships with each other. They felt accountable to each other. Maybe through restoration of reciprocity, especially in Hawaii, thinking about our food systems, if we can restore connections, if we can restore our food systems, particularly, we import 80% of our foods, and that's a huge amount of our ecological footprint. Maybe we can also reduce greenhouse gas emissions at the same time. And maybe that can help in a very small way alleviate climate change. And through that too, I think we can achieve other objectives, which, especially in 2020, 2021 are more important to us than ever, that we can envision restorative justice and equitable futures for all of us. But it's hard to, it's not a direct connection, but through the development of our solutions, I think we can. So I am curious now, and I rambled on far too long, I apologize. Going back to the original question, how do Indigenous voices and experiences shift the conversation on climate change? That's for me still an open question, but I would love to hear kind of your thoughts, as well as if any parts of this talk kind of resonated for you. And if you'd like to contact me and keep the conversation going, though I'm not sure how good I am on email. My email is below, Kagawa, Kagawa, at Hawaii.edu. So thanks. I'm sorry, I talked quite a bit, but I can stop sharing here. And yeah, let's see.
That was so great. Thank you.
Okay. I'm Minerva. Oh.
We usually go through a round of questions and answers. So
Okay.
Anyone have any particular questions for Dr. Aurora at this time?
Will you be my best friend? Just saying.
Sure, I'll be your friend. or I mean, yeah. I don't know.
It was amazing.
Oh, thanks. I'm just trying to share what I see, and honestly, like I feel like the people who are my heroes are the people I cited who have like words for things I didn't have words for. So I'm glad I read. Like I read a lot because I'm looking for inspiration. Maria?
So, yeah, my question is, how do you see this way of thinking slowly but surely being like integrated into academia? Like, I know you said a lot of the folks that you speak to are predominantly white cis male. I can definitely empathize with that, being a Black person in predominantly white spaces a lot of the time. So I just wanted to get your perspective on that.
You know, all of my PhD advisors, oh, sorry, not all of my PhD, all of my advisors have been white cis males, but you know, I've learned things from them. I've also come to acknowledge that they can't answer all the things that I have frustrations about. And that's where it's been important for me to seek out mentors that sort of experience the world as I do. I think there's, you know, when I watch on Twitter, I find there's like connections to people, and I'm like, you're going through the same experience as me, but we don't know each other at all. And that's really interesting. And I find connection and comfort knowing that I'm not crazy, that other people experience it, but you know, I'm not necessarily around that more. And that, sorry, long way short, I think that gives me a sense of greater confidence in myself, so that when I'm in spaces where, you know, I'm in a DEI meeting for my USGS office, and I'm not frustrated that people don't understand. I understand that they don't understand because they haven't walked through the world like I have. So I don't, you know, I'm frustrated at the system that people don't understand, and it takes me more work. But I've learned after watching friends sort of go off and it being very counterproductive to their own objectives, that it's my job to figure out, if I want to be understood, I need to find a language and a way to communicate in a way that works for my readers. And maybe that's or the people I communicate with. So maybe if you're in journalism, it's the same. You have to understand your audience. And so I had to manage my, I have to pause and think about how to communicate effectively, but important to that is also having a community of support. So I don't know, does that make sense? I could not before. There's a period of my life where I was just frustrated and depressed for a couple of years because I didn't know how to figure that part out. And once I found people, I was able to communicate better with people who didn't understand. Yeah. If that's, yeah. Any comments? Challenges? I'm open to challenge.
I guess I have another question. So I was really struck by what you said about how the people who are observing and impacted by the climate change, like, aren't in the same room as the policymakers and like the people with PhDs.
Oh yeah.
And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how to address that, but also to do it in a way where the people experiencing it get to be like an active participant in the discussion and not just the object of study that gets reported to a panel.
Yeah, I think like when I started out my PhD with a bunch of other friends, like we told each other, our job is we're going to amplify the voices of our communities. And slowly but surely, people starting asking us to be the experts on their communities, almost like this talk, right? And I think what I'm starting to try to do more is actually, I didn't do it here, but doing interviews where I can record their own voices and then credit these individuals. But I'm not trained as a social scientist, so I'm currently learning how to do that appropriately, making sure I have consent and approval, because I think that like shortening that gap, right? And we can do it. I think social media has been kind of incredible in some ways for letting those unheard voices be heard. But those don't count, like social media doesn't count for like legislators or academics. So I think one talk I did, I literally interviewed people and then embedded video and audio recording in it and presented it at American Geophysical Union. That was a lot of work. It was a big file. but you know, it's doable. So I think we just got to put a little bit of effort into thinking about how, and often for me, like I grew up in urban Honolulu, so I wouldn't have known these old timers had I not done work out there, and they know me and trust me, so they'll share things with me. And I'm still trying to figure out how to let them. One thing I've learned with the Water Commission actually is that because we've gone online, they've been able to submit testimony directly themselves via Zoom. I don't know if this happens in other communities, but like people on Molokai are literally in the Zoom boardroom saying, this is why we need our water, because we cannot, you know, allow our families to live on in this place without enough water to take care of our needs. So, you know, it's not me speaking for them. But yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it's a good challenge. I think a lot of times there's a lack of awareness. I think it's increasing awareness of the decision makers and academics that those voices are there, even because, you know, everybody, I mean, I'm in this blocky building. They don't know. So you have to know that there's people to listen to begin that. Sorry, that was a long answer. Yeah, it's social. You know, a lot of times folks in rural communities, or maybe who don't have a college degree, feel they're not smart and don't want to speak up. I think having allyship means encouraging people who don't feel empowered to know that they have a voice or that they have something important to say. I've seen lawyers at the law school help coach community members on how to give testimony. So, you know, these are like students helping other folks that are family and friends to not be afraid of that process. So, yeah. And Elon Musk is driving up prices. Yes.
I always go there. Sorry, I always.
Oh, but we
there.
have Larry Ellison. We have, you know, Mark Zuckerberg. We have like there are so many wealthy people with second, third, fourth homes in Hawaii, and it's really hard when you know your own family can't afford to. Yeah.
We're actually I'm having friends that are starting to become displaced because of that, or having to move back in with family.
Yeah.
Because like within the year it just jumped up a certain percentage that is just, then it's all billionaires that are coming, trying to take the land and, you know, make their what I call plantations. And you know, it's just, when I saw y'all's percentages of like what the housing market was going, I just like, my heart bled for y'all, just because I was like, that's not right. That's just, you know, it hurt.
Yeah.
It hurt for me.
I mean, I don't even understand what those numbers mean, because I don't think I've even ever necessarily had enough to consider, like, or enough job stability to consider like buying. Yeah. But on the other hand, yeah, I mean, the thing that does save, at least if you're from Hawaii and have family, you do have a safety net. You know, there are people who have moved to Hawaii who are, say, working in hotel industry, who don't have those safety nets. And so that's also, like, even though it's difficult for Hawaiians, I mean, the family and community support networks are super important. Yeah, that's a whole different story. Okay, climate exchange. Hawaii is a great leader in state climate action. Do I know about that and its progress related to local indigenous community? Well, there's a state climate commission, and then there's the Honolulu Climate Commission. I guess I know members on both, but I feel like the Honolulu Climate Commission, I think it's resilientoahu.org, is far more organized and has more capacity to be really, and is very progressive. I think the state climate commission is too political and bulky. There's a lot of people who are like foot dragging on because of the need to protect business interests. But Progress related to local indigenous community, I think that's being championed by maybe a total of 2 people that I know. Rosie Allegado, Kealoha Fox. There might be more. Actually, Lala Nuss. And it's all women. So I'm looking at this like this group and going, oh, this is interesting. You know, maybe this is the change. I think there's still a real lack of understanding of how to engage with the Hawaiian community and community in general. When I think about who talks about climate change on Oahu, at least in these sort of policy and academic circles, a lot of people have been in Hawaii maybe less than 10 years. And, you know, we have a certain history and context, as I described, that can make it, you know, in my opinion, there's a lot of complexities to navigate. So, and even on a given island, there's different sort of communities and different communities. That's true of any place, maybe different community different communities, different politics, different sort of demographic priorities and economic standings. So I guess my short answer is I don't, but I could give you some websites and maybe a follow-up person to talk to.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm working here in Maryland, state policy, and so I, you know, just following that a little bit is helpful to
you know, I mean, I think Hawaii in general, like, we know changes are happening. Maybe that's my bubble, you know, because maybe people are closer to the environment. It's much more normalized, like, oh yeah, sea level's rising. Like, it's not a question. It's hotter. Like, if you've been paying attention, you know it's hotter. That now you got to use the AC at night. And you've been living in the same place for a long time. So I don't know if it's because we're a blue state. It's still it's still socially conservative, but environmentally blue, I guess. Yeah, and I think the governor has tried to make a big push for climate change being something he does. Yeah, that's right. So. Yeah, it's interesting to hear. I still think we're not doing enough, but
yeah, it's a real challenge.
Well, I have a question for you guys. Who's your next speaker? Is that for Lewis?
Well, I'll hop in. Yeah, it's a good question. It's a new kind of transition, literally in the last few weeks. And so even though you had a number of months to prepare, we have some questions on next speakers, and, you know, kind of it might be more of an internal discussion because we've had a number of great speakers. It might be time to kind of think through it and kind of chat with more. Do we want to see more of this? Do we want to see repeat speakers? Do we want to see in different groups that we've missed? I think it's a way to listen to silence. So I think it's a great question. And from my perspective, since you're looking for some feedback, one thing that I truly am taking away from your talk, Aurora, is your optimism. And I think that's really exciting, especially with Indigenous voices, how maybe we see ourselves as victims and kind of powerless, and in many ways kind of looking at things happening, you know, maybe to our people, but, you know, coming away with this idea that we are resilient, that we are, you know, we have knowledge that not only can help us adapt and mitigate the, you know, kind of the circumstances, it can actually make change. And I think that optimism for me is a key takeaway. There's a lot more I can chat about, but, you know, from my perspective, that was really exciting.
Thanks.
Okay, I do know we are a bit over on time. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. But Karina, or does anyone else have kind of last minute questions before we let Aurora, go.
There is a question in the chat, and I think I would make that the last question. Normally what happens in this meeting is we say we're going to be here an hour and people stay over.
Okay.
So,
I planned for that on my calendar. So,
because we end up having some interesting discussions. So we are reading Maria's question.
Don't feel pressured to answer if you don't have
yeah.
time, by the way.
Yeah, no, resilience is a funny word. I have, so my PhD was in geography, and there's a whole lot of people, there's a field within geography called political ecology that interrogates sort of the social production of environmental problems, which is kind of what I lean on, except I'm not formally trained in it. So there's a lot of jargon I was a little bit cautious about. But resilience is problematic because what are we trying to be resilient to? What are we trying to buffer? Are we capitalism is extraordinarily resilient. I mean, shoot, we said we're going to bounce back better from tourism, and we have just been flooded, and it's really straining people here. So yes, I don't. There's a paper I read which was called Vulnerability Before Adaptation, but it could have just as well been vulnerability before resilience. And we have to think about the things the structures that we have that prop up, that create vulnerability, right? Like with pandemic, we're like, oh, vulnerable populations, as if that's like inherent, that it's not actually created by like lack of access to healthcare, living in food deserts, like structural racism. So yeah, I didn't know what crowd this is going to be, and I wasn't sure if like, how radical to get.
Get rowdy, girl, get rowdy.
Well, yeah, I was like, who's in the Citizens Climate Lobby? Actually, that's really like, how many, is there a Hawaii chapter of the Citizens Climate Lobby? I wonder who's in it. See, in Hawaii, a lot of like the food systems conversations and climate conversations are, I'm gonna just say are dominated by really good progressive people, but like not from Hawaii. I mean, okay, I'll just be like not representative are very Hawaiian, Filipino, Asia Pacific demographics, and I think that's also part of our challenge. If it's seen as like, oh, climate change planning is just from the academic white people from the mainland, people aren't going to buy it, so I think, Maria, you mentioned earlier, how does some of that change? I think it's important for, I'm just gonna say, like, I've taken it upon myself to be in those spaces and to try and provide voice to things that aren't being said. And I'm gonna look up this energy justice professor, Shalonda Baker. But I think the way I tackle it is like restorative justice is part of climate change work. If it's not part of my agenda, at least. That climate justice is to me more important. But that's not is that a mainstream thread yet? Like it's shifting a little bit, maybe?
Definitely with that climate exchange where I'm working, it is, yeah. I'm sorry, I had to move into air conditioning because it got so hot where I am, but I'm on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. And absolutely, I mean, I think, Citizens Climate Lobby does a revenue neutral feedback with carbon fee and dividend, but we're looking at carbon pricing policy that, is working from a justice standpoint. So the revenue is going back to the folks who are harmed in frontline communities.
Okay.
New federal legislation actually also that's looking at pricing particulate pollution as well. So, really discouraging from new places going in places and harming people in that way,
Yeah.
So there's some work there. I think there's some shift in the thinking in the last couple of years. What do you think, Karina?
I would say, yeah. At least in the folks that have been joining the organization, there has been more conversation about environmental justice, and it's sort of like, how do I describe it? We're trying to answer the question of the realities of what we're seeing. And I think I can position it that way. But the organization as a whole has decided to adopt carbon pricing as their first solution to tackle And then they will figure once we can address that solution, then we'll work for another solution. So they tackle one solution at a time, which can be sometimes a little bit frustrating for a lot of our volunteers, because we want to engage in other types of solutions, but as an organization, the first one that we decided to tackle was carbon pricing.
Yeah, that's good to hear that people are thinking about that, because I think in the Honolulu setting, if you're gonna deal with like emissions from a citizen, and I'm not an economist, I'm not a carbon person, but like just thinking about like who has access to, like who has to commute to work and where they're commuting from provides that disproportionate cost on people who are least able to carry it. And so I'm interested in how many people are like training to really think about the economics and the complexities of trying to develop just economic solutions. It's not something I know even where to begin. But
that's great. I'm writing that down.
Yeah, I mean, like that isn't just like a blunt tool.
There is just transition.
What's that?
Just transition. Some people
Just
are working
transition. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So just look up the concept and you can come out with a lot of concepts and how people are working on that. But that's like a new concept that kind of bring the concept that you were talking about.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I need all the keywords to look up. So
that's a good one. Just transition.
Just transition.
Like,
yeah.
The workers, transitioning away from fossil fuel jobs, but in every kind of way, right?
Yeah. One thing in Hawaii I've seen, and this was with the Kahuku wind farm issue, is that AES, which supplies a lot of the energy, was the coal-fired plant, and now AES is running wind. And so there's a lot of like desire to hold on to power, to hold on to a captive market in Hawaii. And we're just changing the technology and not necessarily, which is, it's not a bad thing, but I think there's a lot of problems with it. So increasing maybe everyone's awareness, like when I'm at home, increasing my own awareness of how we get our energy and where our emissions are. Oh, thanks. I hope I can save this to save all my chat messages. So I will look up the Citizens Climate Lobby here, and be interesting to see who is and who isn't involved, and maybe to promote other Facebook. Yeah, it's hard because everybody's again busy, busy trying to make it in the short term. Oh, okay. Yeah, there are a lot of great organizations associated. So, yeah.
So that's a great definition of just transition: vision-led, unifying, place-based.
Maria, one of the things I was thinking about was like the concept of sort of mapping. I don't know if you guys have talked to anybody who's doing like mapping vulnerability.
Okay, that just made me really excited because I love maps. Everybody in my like group knows that I love maps and GIS and showing like illustrating concepts that way.
Yeah.
So just I'll shut up and listen. Go.
Is that like for your fun job or like just or your professional?
It's something that I've done in my research.
Okay.
And I've kind of become obsessed with.
Sorry, can I ask what your research is?
I've done research on climate change vulnerability in BIPOC communities. So kind of like similar.
Yeah, like I think there's, I'm not a real geographer, but like participatory mapping and these sort of ways of democratizing, decolonizing, using maps, which are a tool of conquest, to do maps as the tool of justice. And I wish I was more of a geographer, GIS person, but I'm like, there's so much that we could do if we think spatially and through time, but like we can do the things we could do interactive web mapping now, like, you know, computer savvy upcoming generations could get into that and really help us to understand like the spatial connectivity, you know, like now you can build do network analyses and who's connected to who and what, and begin to really understand yeah, sorry, this is the nerdy side of me, like understand just how connected everything is, and then we can understand it, maybe we can then think more holistically. But yeah, I also hear the organizations can't do everything all the time at once, so the challenge of doing things sequentially versus like exhaustively. Oh yeah, the environmental justice group of EP, I've seen some things here. I was also gonna say, like, I lurk on the Rising Voices listserv. It's part of UCAR, University Center for Atmospheric Research, and there are a lot of like good thinkers there. Some of the people I quote, but there are a lot of like younger scholars too who identify as Indigenous or allied, and there's a lot of interesting exchanges. I don't think a lot of it's super action oriented, like policy. Well, that's not true. There's some federal agency people, but I really like the grassroots nature of this group, and I'm embarrassed to say I've not paid too much attention to the Citizens Climate Lobby, so I'm excited to be more aware now.
It's absolutely fantastic. Go ahead, Hope.
Oh, I just put in a link to the EJ screen that Dr. Jacoby Wilson over here in Maryland created for the state of Maryland. And he's on the White House team for environmental justice leaders. But he's created this tool just for Maryland that I've yet to study, but I'm working on that. So maybe Maria, you'd be interested in that.
I didn't get through on it, but maybe, yeah.
This is fantastic. I am loving the connections here, and Maria's face just completely like lit up at the possible connection. I think you guys should talk further.
Yeah. You have my email.
I was going to ask a bit, and I think this will be the last thing because I don't want to keep people longer than they need to be. I often think about this work on how we are informing different communities about what's happening around them. So before I joined CCL, I was a journalist. And at that point, we didn't have climate journalists like we have now. And I hear that word now more. And I know of journalists that are actually training from anything from climate science to anything that they need to know in order to do effective reporting, which part of the challenge is how do you take all that amount of information and make it so that people can understand that we're in a crisis and we need to start talking about more solutions, right? So there's a lot of challenge there. When I think of this team and everyone that has come here to grace us with, their presentations or their knowledge of the different communities, I constantly wonder, where do you find the most challenge in trying to get a regular folk that's not involved in, at CCL, we have the challenge of how do we engage anyone who doesn't believe that politics, that they can actually talk to their elected official. So we talk a lot about empowering people to talk to the person that represents them. But I wonder from your end and from your experience, what that has been like for you, and where do you see the challenge there?
I'll admit I've been in an academic bubble for the last 7 years, but what I found effective when I've watched my friends and when I was working in community, it's like, that face-to-face interaction really matters if you're a trusted person. Like when the pandemic was starting, I started Facebook posting like crazy because I was afraid that actually we were going to get hit really hard in Hawaii because we're connected to Asia, and I was afraid that my community didn't understand what was happening, wanted to. And it was interesting to kind of watch me and my friends try and act as translators, because we had background in biology or public health, and just really go on messaging blast. And so it's like, remember, like people who you can relate to, who trust you. I mean, I think people know this about climate change or other things too, right? That or like vaccines, right? Like if somebody is encouraging you, you're more likely to do it. You may not have to understand all of the underlying science of it. You may not have to understand what mRNA vaccines versus are, but you do know that somebody you trust is asking you to do something. So I think, as a scientist, I like data. Graphs mean something to me. The reality, and I know this, and it breaks my heart a little bit, but like a lot of people don't care about the graphs and the numbers in the same way I do, and I have to be okay with that. I see my friend Katie Kamelamela, and Lewis has met her. We butt heads, but I really appreciate, she's really good at graphics, like conceptualizations, and she works with community, and she also worked in a congressperson's office for a year, and she saw like how concise you need to be, how you have to not give too much detail, because if you give too much information, people shut down, right? I suffer from that problem. Yeah, as you can tell. So I think, and really making it meet people where they're at. Like one thing I learned in geography is people don't make, we're not making decisions for the globe, we're making decisions for our families. So if we can talk about climate change in a way that we understand how it affects our daily decisions for our households, that is part of behavior changing, right? I saw people start growing more food at home when their kids came home from school, because their schools had school gardens, and they had yards, but they were growing like grass. But then they started their garden boxes. So I mean, if you want to be subversive, there's all kinds of books on how to do propaganda, right? But I think the thing is, we don't want to be deploying those kinds of tactics. But yeah, trusted source. I mean, you're a journalist, you know this better than me. These are the simplified messages, like not dumbing down. I hear academics talk about, I don't want to dumb down things. It's like, you're not dumbing it down. You're making it work for, you're meeting people where they're at. And I think, again, because climate scientists always talk about climate science in like complicated terms, because that's what you get the big grants for, it sort of fills out your CV and makes you feel important. Sorry. But that's not helpful. And I often, for myself, grapple with like, there's being right technically, and there's being helpful. And it's really more important that we do what's helpful and effective than obsess over being right. So that's, I think, takes a certain amount of like reflection and openness to feedback. And I think you have to also be excited. Like, nobody wants to deal with climate because it's a crisis. Like, we want to deal with it because it's going to make a better future for people we care about. So I think that's kind of what I found empowering about, I think I really follow the way Kyle Powers-White and Robin Wall Kimmer. If you've never read Braiding Sweetgrass, like, it's amazing. And Gathering Moss. And her other works, like I really love The Fortress, The River, and the Garden. Like, I could read it over and over and find new things. So people, what is it? Like, honey is better than vinegar or something. Like that excitement, like, people came to the Mauna not necessarily to stop bulldozer. Well, I mean, maybe that was the first step, but they kept coming because they were having positive, rejuvenating connections with people. They were learning things, they were reconnecting, they were expanding their understandings of the world and themselves. And so that was inspiring. And that's why the momentum kept up. Like, so yeah, it's not just, climate change is a long-term, slow-moving crisis. And if we respond to it like it's a wildfire, we're going to burn out, and then people will be cynical afterwards. So, I mean, I think we do need to like move quickly on some things, but then there's also like a slow, I think there's like short games and long games. So, but yeah, and there's also like very community specific ways of reaching people. Like I remember hearing, sorry, I'm going to ramble on, but like I remember hearing like when a Samoan pastor was talking to his congregation about how, people were questioning, how did the vaccines come about so quickly? And he's like, well, because God blessed, these scientists to develop this on like unanticipated speeds, and that's why you trust it. And you're like, oh, that it was really interesting because that's what he knew would work for his congregation. And so it's not something I would have thought of, but that like each community kind of has its way of what resonates for them. Yeah. So.
Thank you.
Maria, I'd be happy to talk about climate scientists sometime. I work with climate scientists too.
Yeah,
that is fantastic.
I would love to just sit and gossip with you. That would
be We got my email. I don't have your email, but
I'll put it in the chat.
Okay.
Me and Patricia after this, best friend.
Okay.
I am I am totally there. Okay, so
it's late on the East Coast. Maybe you should.
It is. It is about to be 9:30 at the East Coast. So, we usually end with some words of wisdom, but I think I will let Louis have the last word because it can't be me anymore. We have a new team leader, so I'm going to give it to Louis.
Thanks, Karina, putting me on the spot. All right, almost sounds like you just need to come back and speak with us, right? So, okay, I'll leave it off. Dr. Kagawa-Viivani, thank you so much for spending time with us. Again, I love the optimism and everything that you've shared. A lot of really great visuals. The canoe is the island is canoe. I think about that on a global scale at this point, and looking at Hawaii as a harbinger, and Indigenous voices are naturally bipartisan. Not the way to think about it, but this idea of approaching a situation and always looking for something positive to come out of it are truly words of wisdom. So really, Aurora, your words to leave the group with. But again, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining, and we will see everyone next month. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone.
Stop the recording.
Thanks again, Aurora.